Hello, everyone. Welcome. Erica and I will be discussing the HyperDoc podcast. Let's jump right into it. We're going to be giving a minute for the first question, 4 minutes for the second, 3 minutes for the rest of the questions. Erica, what's our first question?
So our first question is, prior to this podcast, what did you already know from it? So I'll start off, I guess. So when I was listening to this or learning about hyperdocs, I didn't really know. I kind of heard of the term before, but I didn't really I knew it was probably part of Google or some kind of domain associated with Google, but I wasn't totally sure how it worked. I had never used it. I just heard the term floating out there and pretty very unfamiliar with it, to say the least. How about you, Nick?
Yeah, I didn't actually know that HyperDoc was the technical term that my CT this semester, Tammy Gunton, uses in her classroom. So that was helpful to actually have the terminology that she uses for it. And I guess the only other thing that I already knew before going into the podcast was just like big concepts. Like they talked a lot about collaboration, that was familiar, enrichment and like adding stuff into the presentation, and assessment. But as far as like the ins and outs specifically of HyperDocs, I didn't really know anything.
Yeah, I think I've used it before, actually. I just didn't, yeah, like you said, I didn't know the technical term, but I think I've seen hyperlinks, I guess, if that's, but this is such a whole new system kind of. So yeah, we've used hyperlinks and clicked on them, but maybe just not hyperdocs. So it's just a broader system. So question number two.
Yeah. What did we learn from the podcast specifically? So I can start on that. I had a couple different points, and I think the main ones that stood out to me the most is the big concept thing. So seeing hyperdocs from the right perspective. So it's not necessarily about just convenience, but it's an opportunity to actually provide students a way to collaborate with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also too, they're all also provided with all the hyperlinks. So how we talked about how we always click on hyperlinks, they're all provided in this one document. I think that's really cool if they're learning a new topic and maybe it's a really broad concept. They're able to click on all these different links and learn about the podcast talked about the 50 states. So introducing them, that was probably an elementary school class. So they were introducing them to the 50 states and what that entailed. So I think it was really cool that so you have like fewer lectures and the students can kind of just dive right into it. I think that was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked just in general seeing how flexible hyperdocs could be. So they talked about, like you can add in those enrichment things for students who finish early and saying, oh yeah, like you're always going to have something that you can work on, so that they don't feel, like they're, that they never get bored.
Mm-hmm.
I can still
I,
stay connected.
right. I think it also limits the amount of questions that students have too about an assignment. Like, oh no, what am I supposed to do? And it avoids that time wasted with a ton of students asking a bunch of questions because they're confused about an assignment. So that way it's just all right there. They can click on it. It's pretty straightforward and self-explanatory. And they even give you templates that you can use that a lot of teachers, they said, have used if they're not really familiar with it. So I would personally probably use the templates because they're very helpful. So they have like an anticipatory set, they have the closing, different resources you can add into your lesson to make it neat and organized, kind of like a virtual formal lesson plan.
Mm. Yeah, well, that was helpful when they actually called it that. So it's, it really is like a digital lesson plan. Um, and I mean, how you're saying with like using the templates, when we're saying how flexible they are, you can change it. And how you specifically do that is like you need to figure out how to like package it in the right way. So it talked about like workflow and packaging are super important.
Mm-hmm.
So like you need to ask what kind of a hyperdoc are you trying to make and what are you going to be using it for?
Right.
So like if it's for assessment, then you would actually have like a lot of Google quizzes in there or just like checking for information. But if it's the kind of thing where you're just trying to expose them to new information and just have them kind of explore it for themselves, then there won't be as much like formal test quiz information in there.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, that's good. So I think question number 3 says, what were the big takeaways from this podcast? So we were kind of already talking about that, also with what we learned. But I think some of the big takeaways were fewer lectures, because I know students get really bored. I have a cooperating teacher who lectures a lot, but I mean, he's a good storyteller, so they're able to stay more engaged. But I know with other teachers, that especially I've had in the past, where it can be pretty disengaging. You're kind of bored just sitting there listening to them talk. This gives them multiple mediums to work with online or on their iPads, so they can look at a podcast or listen to that, and then they can, like what we did, or they can watch a YouTube clip about the lesson that they're going to be learning, or maybe it's taking notes while watching a video, things like that. So I think it's a good resource to use, different opportunities for students to learn the material and not have to just listen to the teacher as the main resource of knowledge. I think that's a really key component of 21st century learning.
Nice. Yeah. I did like how they talked about the different things that you can put in there, because there are more options, because it's like an online thing. So I think within that, though, it was, at first I was unsure, because I wasn't really confident in like how I could see this being used in my classroom. And I honestly, I was a little bit biased against it, because I thought, you know, they're like constantly just staring at the screen. And so how is that specifically helping them learn? So I had some stuff in here where it's like, you need to make it visually appealing. So, you know, it's going to be engaging, and you can actually make it as engaging as if you were lecturing up front. And then, I mean, we already kind of talked about this, but like not feeling the pressure to use it every single class, and then just kind of like spreading it out. So I thought that was really helpful. But I think the big thing that was really helpful for me was just to not be afraid of HyperDocs, because you only need to use it as much as it's actually going to be useful to you.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So I was kind of thinking, I think it would be resourceful or useful if the was gone one day. So instead of having to print out all these worksheets for the students and using a printer, because I know my CT has been gone a few times for meetings, and he's had to always run to the copier and print out a ton of paper to give the sub and the students. And so with HyperDocs, I think it's really useful if the students already have it there and they can just work on that while the teacher is gone. Obviously not use it not use it very frequently. I mean, because I think you do have to find that nice balance of kind of like what you talked about. I know your CT used that a lot, where they would just kind of be staring at the screen and not getting a lot of interaction going on. So I think maybe just testing it out, see how the students do with it, ask them what they thought about it, and kind of go from there.
Okay. Yeah. He asked, like, you should incorporate student feedback. And I think, that was the last thing that I wanted to talk about for this one, where it's like, he talked about refining your HyperDocs from year to year. So like, yeah, we may use this in like our first year of teaching, and we may not be completely happy with how, you know, the students like engaged with a certain video or whatever. But the nice thing is that, you know, it's super easy to just like switch out that video for something else that you think is better, and then test it the next year, and then just keep doing that and refining and making the HyperDoc better. But, you know, it's going to take time. So that was helpful.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think just a couple other things that I had on here. Are
you on question 4 or?
We're almost there. Yeah, so just want to emphasize like giving credit if you use somebody else's hyperdoc and you like switch it around with copyright. That was a good reminder for me. And then also like reach out for help, because there are actually ways to, get support from other people and figure out how to work the hyperdocs better. And then there was like, make sure to design it so that it's like age appropriate. So like don't put high school content if it's meant for a junior high. But
right. Yeah.
Did you have anything?
I think the last big key takeaway I had was more face-to-face interaction. The women in the podcast talked about how a lot of students need individual attention, especially in more diverse classrooms with ELs and people with IEPs. They need more attention sometimes. So with the hyperdocs, I think it's really good if all the students are working on that. That way you can circulate the classroom and interact with your students more. So it's just more face-to-face interaction. If someone has a question or needs help with something, the hyperdoc runs itself and allows the students to work through it without having you to guide them through the whole thing. So I think it's really good if you want to get to know your students on a more personal level and walk around and help them with anything they need. So I thought that was really cool.
I agree with that. I think that was probably the biggest takeaway for me too, where it's like, it's not just that they're staring at screens, it's that it's actually freeing you up to get away from standing up in front of the classroom all the time and actually just hand the work over to them, let them show you what they know, and then like help them along the way. And you can actually work with like the EL learners because, the more advanced students in your class, they'll be doing fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Most of the time. Okay, so question is for you. What did you find interesting about this podcast?
Go for it. What did you find?
Oh, okay. So I think just the templates, we kind of already touched on this a bit, but the templates that you can use just to make your lesson plans more effective and kind of gives you a guide. So I think that's what Kidden was kind of like this too, where you could find lesson plans on their site. So this was kind of a subcategory of it, but just I think more efficient use of your time in the class. So once you make the lesson plans, it's more efficient use of your time with face-to-face interaction, and makes you less stressed out because you've made these. I think, back in the 20th century learning, you had to handwrite your lessons and use a ton of paper. So I think I really like this concept of using less paper, not going completely paperless, because that's pretty much impossible. But, it just really saves on unnecessary waste of paper. And then the students are, it's a more engaging, different types of mediums they can work with, whether it's YouTube, podcasts, they can see images, take notes on their iPad. I think it's really good, different use of resources on there. And then they can connect it to the real world too, because they're on their iPads and they can just find different things that maybe connect with it. And then they can also collaborate on the hyperdocs as well. So I think, and just make their own. They can even make their own too. I remember them talking about in the podcast how the fourth or fifth graders of this teacher's classroom, they were already making a hyperdoc for the next year's students, which I thought was crazy, because I thought only the teacher could really do this, but the students also have access to make hyperdocs as well for future students in that class.
Yeah, because they can make like a copy of it.
Yeah, I was like, oh, okay, it's not just the teacher's thing, it's also the students. So,
but at the same time, we'll get to that, but that connects with one of the questions for number 7 that I had.
I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of you.
All right, no, that's okay. So you said collaboration, and I found it was interesting how the podcast made me think about what new kinds of collaboration can you actually.
Yeah, I tried. It mentioned collaboration briefly, but it wasn't the type of collaboration I have in mind. It's more like they can make hyperdocs and have different ways of doing it and creating their own and making it their own. And well, I guess if you think of collaboration, I guess they could talk about the lesson after they went through the whole thing, but there's no breaks in between them learning it. They see all the information, they're reading all through it, they're watching the videos. They could talk about afterward, but is there really time to talk about it maybe afterward? I think that's a big concern I have, is because I always frequently want them interacting in between activities or something big that they just learned. So I think instead of just doing the whole thing and then talking about it, I think just maybe pausing in between that and finding that nice balance of using HyperDocs and also collaborating.
Yeah, and I you could probably open like a Google Doc and then invite multiple students into that, and then they could collaborate in that way to create something and like add like different paragraphs or whatever.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I could see that happening. I think the only other thing that I found particularly interesting was like actually putting in interaction points like you're talking about, like actually include in the HyperDoc, okay, once you get to this page, talk to the teacher and actually like check in.
Talk to your partner.
Come and check your work so that they know to stop and like not just keep, facing the iPad, but like actually get out of that and transition into something different and then go back to it.
Yeah, I just thought that as I was talking, I forgot that you can embed, Google Slides and Google Docs now into the HyperDocs. So it's kind of a subcategory, and then they could turn and talk to their partner. They could collaborate with their peers. And so I think that's really cool that they use the G Suites or the Google Docs forms, feedback, things like that, and into the HyperDocs. So it just makes it accessible for all different resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I think the last thing was just like for our EL learners and everything, you can actually differentiate the HyperDoc to be a little bit easier reading level or whatever, and then send that version to the EL learner, and it's really like subtle and not easily noticeable, so they won't feel like awkward or feel like they're sticking out.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and you can change the fonts even too. Just ways of differentiation to small things would make a big difference. So let's see. Question 5. As a student, have you seen this topic applied in any classroom you were in? Take that one away.
Yeah, so I saw Mrs. Gunton use it this semester a lot. And it was useful when she had to take a leave of absence, an emergency leave of absence for a while. And she was able to just send the presentations to her students with all the links, and then they could actually explore everything for themselves, so that the sub pretty much only had to, explain after they had explored. I was homeschooled, so I haven't really seen this modeled in a classroom as far as like, growing up. But now on the other side, explorations in teaching, I saw that, they would use iPads, but my cooperating teacher last year for explorations didn't really use that strategy. So it's pretty much just been this semester really seeing it for the first time.
Yeah, same here. Even though I was at public school, I came from a 20th century public school, well, all of my life, teacher lecturing the whole time. Besides elementary school, obviously that was more interactive, but high school on up and junior high on up to high school, it was just the teacher lecturing at you. You take notes, no one talk. The teacher is the fundamental resource of knowledge. So you talk, you disrespect the teacher. We talked sometimes if they wanted us to work in partners, but it was only by instruction. And so it was very much behind the times. I never even knew teachers did this kind of stuff until I even got into this credential program. So I think that was just a really big wake-up call and a way new learning curve for me, because I'm just so used to, I didn't know that you had to you don't have to, but just all the technology that's out there and the different resources that teachers and students can use to differentiate learning is just so different than from the 20th century lecture, note-taking, memorize the notes, just no differentiation, all the same. That's what I grew up with. So I was just like, I thought that was the only way you could learn until this. So, I never saw HyperDocs used not even with my CT either, because he's pretty old fashioned. You already know this, but so yeah. So I mean, just beyond just PowerPoint, he basically uses. So no, I haven't seen it as a student or any other teacher use it.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
it was interesting.
I know. Yeah. So
question 6. It's as a teacher. Okay, how are we going to apply this to our future classrooms?
Pressure's on.
Go for it.
Oh, dang it. Okay. Okay. So I thought, well, baby steps. So maybe try it out. Like we kind of talked about earlier. Maybe use it once a week, maybe even once a month. See how the students like it. Provide a Google form for them to fill out. See what they thought about it. And I don't know if I seem to get the hang of it. I remember the one woman in the podcast talked about how it took her a really long time to figure out how to really use it and make it look nice. And then once she figured it out, she kept adding all these nice backgrounds and fonts. And she's like, oh, it's getting better and it looks really nice. So I think that's the approach I would take, just taking a little bit of time, kind of playing around with it, see how I could use it for my classroom. But if I did use it, I would probably use it for a really big topic like the American Revolution or the Civil War and break it down by each section or each battle. And so that it's not too overwhelming, because they said not to overdo it and include a ton of information that's going to be overwhelming for the students. So just break it down. I think your CT might have done this, where just broke it down into different categories or sections. So maybe if we're talking about social class or geography of a particular state or a certain battle, I think that would be the most effective way, just so they're not being ambushed with all the information at once.
That's fair. Yeah, I think, it's going to take time. I see HyperDocs as being a tool, but I said that it's not something that I really want to like take over my classroom or define it. So variety, adding this in with a lot of different other things. But at the same time, like each of these things, it's a tool, but it shouldn't be a replacement of the teacher, because that's what we're there to do.
Yeah, for sure. Variety is definitely really key, and I want to do that as well. So it's finding that balance as we're learning this. So what further questions does this podcast spark?
I have 4 different ones. So the first one was, how has the role of a teacher within a classroom changed the result of technology, and then like the positives and negatives of these changes? So because we have a tool like HyperDocs, it is requiring the teacher to step away from the front of the class, which is, tradition says that that's what's been happening over the past decades, like for so long. So, and it's all just specifically because of all this technology coming out over the past few decades or something. So I thought that was interesting. And then I was also wondering, how can we give students access to their iPads and all of these tools and everything, while still like being strategic about preventing them from accessing things that like distract from the lesson? So are there actual blockers that we can put on the iPads so that, they don't even have the option to actually access the internet or YouTube or whatever? Or should we be able to trust them enough and like teach them how to use it responsibly? I would say yes, but at the same time, as new as I am with HyperDocs, it would kind of be difficult if I'm trying it out for the first couple weeks, and then most of my time is spent just like keeping them on task, and just actually listening to what they're supposed to do and like keeping them off of YouTube or whatever.
Yeah, that was kind of a similar question I had. Not only just finding the balance between HyperDocs and traditional learning that the backgrounds we kind of came from, or just making it more engaging. I mean, this is a good way to make it engaging, but I see a more different approach to that, where it's just more, making history come to life instead of through the iPad, just actually doing historical role plays or activities that facilitate learning. But I think a question I would have is just how do we find that balance, and also can students maybe one day collaborate on the, well, we kind of already answered that before, but just being flexible with the HyperDocs. And I guess the privacy too, because I didn't really read into that much. I'm still trying to learn this, but how does the privacy settings work on HyperDocs, and can other teachers or people access this?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I just think it's really important. Like, if there's a way to eliminate distractions for students, I think we should take those, because it's meant to be a tool. It's supposed to teach students how to use it responsibly. So, I think more than anything, it's just like, where is technology actually going to take you and me as teachers in the years to come? Like, what is the typical classroom going to look like? And if that is actually moving in a good direction, or what can we do to make that happen? Like change things that are even happening right now to move in the best direction possible.
Yeah, and just not doing change for the sake of change, but actually just doing it because you want to try it out. And if it doesn't work, fine, then do another tech tool or something, or go back to what you already know and are confident. And if it's worked, keep going with it. But of course, it's never bad to change things up, but doing it for the sake of change and trying to change the entire way you taught or teach, then it's not really effective.
That's fair. Yep. I mean, it was useful. I liked it.
Yeah, it was cool. Yeah, I liked learning about it. Glad that that's out there. Want to use that as a resource maybe next year, or as we tackle the years ahead for teaching.
I think that's about it. But yeah, that was question 7. And yeah, I had a good time.
Yeah, you have the recording, so.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.